Existentialism is a term applied to the work of certain late 19th and 20th century European philosophers who, despite profound doctrinal differences, shared the belief that philosophical thinking begins with the human subject, not merely the thinking subject, but the acting, feeling, living human individual. While the predominant value of existentialist thought is commonly acknowledged to be freedom, its primary virtue is authenticity. In the view of the existentialist, the individual's starting point is characterized by what has been called the existential attitude, or a sense of disorientation and confusion in the face of an apparently meaningless or absurd world. Many existentialists have also regarded traditional systematic or academic philosophies, in both style and content, as too abstract and remote from concrete human experience. Soren Kierkegaard is generally considered to have been the first existentialist philosopher, though he did not use the term existentialism. He proposed that each individual, not society or religion, is solely responsible for giving meaning to life and living it passionately and sincerely, or authentically. Existentialism became popular in the years following World War II and strongly influenced many disciplines besides philosophy, including theology, drama, art, literature, and psychology. Definitional issues and background. There has never been general agreement on the definition of existentialism. The term is often seen as a historical convenience, as it was first applied to many philosophers in hindsight, long after they had died. In fact, while existentialism is generally considered to have originated with Kierkegaard, the first prominent existentialist philosopher to adopt the term as a self-description was Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre posits the idea that what all existentialists have in common is the fundamental doctrine that existence precedes essence. As scholar Frederick Copleston explains, according to philosopher Stephen Crowell, defining existentialism has been relatively difficult, and he argues that it is better understood as a general approach used to reject certain systematic philosophies rather than as a systematic philosophy itself. Sartre himself, in a lecture delivered in 1945, described existentialism as the attempt to draw all the consequences from a position of consistent atheism. Although many outside Scandinavia consider the term existentialism to have originated from Kierkegaard himself, it is more likely that Kierkegaard adopted this term from the Norwegian poet and literary critic Johann Sebastian Welhaven. This assertion comes from two sources. The Norwegian philosopher Erik Lundestad refers to the Danish philosopher Frederick Christian Sibben. Sibben is supposed to have had two conversations in 1841, the first with Welhaven and the second with Kierkegaard. It is in the first conversation that it is believed that Welhaven came up with a word that he said covered a certain thinking, which had a close and positive attitude to life, a relationship he described as existential. This was then brought to Kierkegaard by Sibben. The second claim comes from the Norwegian historian Rune Slagstad, who claims to prove that Kierkegaard himself said the term existential was borrowed from the poet. He strongly believes that it was Kierkegaard himself who said that Hegelians do not study philosophy existentially, to use a phrase by Welhaven, from one time when I spoke with him about philosophy. On the other hand, the Norwegian historian Annelise Seipe is critical of Slagstad, and believes the statement in fact stems from the Norwegian literary historian Cathrinus Bang. Concepts. Existence precedes essence. Sartre claimed that a central proposition of existentialism is that existence precedes essence, which means that the most important consideration consideration for individuals is that they are individuals, independently acting and responsible, conscious beings, rather than what labels, roles, stereotypes, definitions, or other preconceived categories the individuals fit. The actual life of the individuals is what constitutes what could be called their true essence, instead of there being an arbitrarily attributed essence others use to define them. Thus, human beings, through their own consciousness, create their own values and determine a meaning to the life. Although it was Sartre who explicitly coined the phrase, similar notions can be found in the thought of existentialist philosophers such as Heidegger and Kierkegaard. The subjective thinker's form, the form of his communication, is his style. His form must be just as manifold as are the opposites that he holds together. The systematic Dre is an abstract form that also must inevitably run into trouble whenever it is to be applied to the concrete. To the same degree as the subjective thinker is concrete, to the same degree his form must also be concretely dialectical. But just as he himself is not a poet, not an ethicist, not a dialectician, so also his form is none of these directly. His form must first and last be related to existence, and in this regard he must have at his disposal the poetic, the ethical, the dialectical, the religious, subordinate character, setting, etc., which belong to the well-balanced character of the aesthetic production, are in themselves breadth. The subjective thinker has only one setting, existence, and has nothing to do with localities and such things. The setting is not the fairyland of the imagination, where poetry produces consummation, nor is the setting laid in England, and historical accuracy is not a concern. The setting is inwardness and existing as a human being. The concretion is the relation of the existence categories to one another. Historical accuracy and historical actuality are breadth. Soren Kierkegaard interpret the imperative to define oneself as meaning that anyone can wish to be anything. However, an existentialist philosopher would say such a wish constitutes an inauthentic existence. Instead, the phrase should be taken to say that people are defined only insofar as they act and that they are responsible for their actions. For example, someone who acts cruelly towards other people is by that act defined as a cruel person. Furthermore, by this action of cruelty, such persons are themselves responsible for the new identity. This is as opposed to the genes, or human nature, bearing the blame. As Sartre writes in his work Existentialism as a Humanism, Man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. Of course, the more positive, therapeutic aspect of this is also implied. A person can choose to act in a different way, and to be a good person instead of a cruel person. Here it is also clear that since humans can choose to be either cruel or good, they are, in fact, neither of these things essentially. Sartre's definition of existentialism was based on Heidegger's magnum opus, Being and Time. In a set of letters, Heidegger implies that Sartre misunderstood him for his own purposes of subjectivism, and that he did not mean that actions take precedence over being so long as those actions were not reflected upon. This way of living, Heidegger called average everydayness. The absurd. The notion of the absurd contains the idea that there is no meaning in the world beyond what meaning we give it. This meaninglessness also encompasses the amorality or unfairness of the world. This contrasts with the notion that bad things don't happen to good people, to the world. Metaphorically speaking, there is no such thing as a good person or a bad person. What happens happens, and it may just as well happen to a good person as to a bad person. Because of the world's absurdity, at any point in time, anything can happen to anyone, and a tragic event could plummet someone into direct confrontation with the absurd. The notion of the absurd has been prominent in literature throughout history. Many of the literary works of Soren Kierkegaard, Samuel Beckett, Franz Kafka, Fyodor Dostoevsky, Eugene Ionesco, Miguel de Unamuno, Luigi Pirandello, Jean-Paul Sartre, Joseph Heller and Albert Camus contain descriptions of people who encountered the absurdity of the world. It is in relation to the concept of the devastating awareness of meaninglessness that Albert Camus claimed that there is only one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide, in his The Myth of Sisyphus. Although prescriptions against the possibly deleterious consequences of these kinds of encounters vary, from Kierkegaard's religious stage to Camus' insistence on persevering in spite of absurdity, the concern with helping people avoid living their lives in ways that put them in the perpetual danger of having everything meaningful break down, is common to most existentialist philosophers. The possibility of having everything meaningful break down poses a threat of quietism, which is inherently against the existentialist philosophy. It has been said that the possibility of suicide makes all humans existentialists. Facticity is a concept defined by Sartre in Being and Nothingness as the in itself, which delineates for humans the modalities of being and not being. This can be more easily understood when considering facticity in relation to the temporal dimension of our past. One's past is what one is, in the sense that it co-constitutes oneself. However, to say that one is only one's past would be to ignore a significant part of reality, while saying that one's past is only what one was would entirely detach it from oneself now. A denial of one's own concrete past constitutes an inauthentic lifestyle, and the same goes for all other kinds of facticity. Facticity is both a limitation and a condition of freedom. It is a limitation in that a large part of one's facticity consists of things one couldn't have chosen, but a condition of freedom in the sense that one's values most likely depend on it. However, even though one's facticity is set in stone, it cannot determine a person. The value ascribed to one's facticity is still ascribed to it freely by the person. As an example, consider two men, one of whom has no memory of his past and the other who remembers everything. They both have committed many crimes, but the first man, knowing nothing about this, leads a rather normal life, while the second man, feeling trapped by his own past, continues a life of crime, blaming his own past for trapping him in this life. There is nothing essential about his committing crimes, but he ascribes this meaning to his past. However, to disregard one's facticity when, in the continual process of self-making, one projects oneself into the future, that would be to put oneself in denial of oneself, and thus would be inauthentic. In other words, the origin of one's projection must still be one's facticity, though in the mode of not being it. Another aspect of facticity is that it entails angst, both in the sense that freedom produces angst when limited by facticity, and in the sense that the lack of the possibility of having facticity to step in for one to take responsibility for something one has done, also produces angst. Another aspect of existential freedom is that one can change one's values. Thus, one is responsible for one's values, regardless of society's values. The focus on freedom in existentialism is related to the limits of the responsibility one bears as a result of one's freedom. The relationship between freedom and responsibility is one of interdependency, and a clarification of freedom also clarifies that for which one is responsible. Authenticity. Many noted existentialist writers consider the theme of authentic existence important. Authentic existence involves the idea that one has to create oneself and then live in accordance with this self. What is meant by authenticity is that in acting, one should act as oneself, not as one's acts, or as one's genes, or any other essence requires. The authentic act practice one that is in accordance with one's freedom. Of course, as a condition of freedom is facticity. This includes one's facticity, but not to the degree that this facticity can in any way determine one's choices. The role of facticity in relation to authenticity involves letting one's actual values come into play when one makes the choice, so that one also takes responsibility for the act instead of choosing either or without allowing the options to have different values. In contrast to this, the inauthentic is the denial to live in accordance with one's freedom. This can take many forms, from pretending choices are meaningless or random, through convincing oneself that some form of determinism is true, to a sort of mimicry, where one acts as one should. How one should act is often determined by an image one has of how one such as oneself acts. This image usually corresponds to some sort of social norm, but this does not mean that all acting in accordance with social norms is inauthentic. The main point is the attitude one takes to one's own freedom and responsibility, and the extent to which one acts in accordance with this freedom. The other and the look. The other is a concept more properly belonging to phenomenology in its account of intersubjectivity. However, the concept has seen widespread use in existentialist writings, and the conclusions drawn from it differ slightly from the phenomenological accounts. The experience of the other is the experience of another free subject who inhabits the same world as a person does. In its most basic form, it is this experience of the other that constitutes intersubjectivity and objectivity. To clarify, when one experiences someone else, and this other person experiences the world only from over there, the world itself is constituted as objective in that it is something that is. They are as identical for both of the subjects. A person experiences the other person as experiencing the same things. This experience of the other's look is what is termed the look, while this experience, in its basic phenomenological sense, constitutes the world as objective, and oneself as objectively existing subjectivity. In existentialism, it also acts as a kind of limitation of freedom. This is because the look tends to objectify what it sees. As such, when one experiences oneself in the look, one doesn't experience oneself as nothing, but as something. Sartre's own example of a man peeping at someone through a keyhole can help clarify this. At first, this man is entirely caught up in the situation he is in. He is in a pre-reflexive state where his entire consciousness is directed at what goes on in the room. Suddenly, he hears a creaking floorboard behind him, and he becomes aware of himself as seen by the other. He is thus filled with shame, for he perceives himself as he would perceive someone else doing what he was doing, as a peeping Tom. The look is then co-constitutive of one's facticity. Another characteristic feature of the look is that no other really needs to have been there. It is quite possible that the creaking floorboard was nothing but the movement of an old house. The look isn't some kind of mystical telepathic experience of the actual way the other sees one. It is only one's perception of the way another might perceive him. Angst and dread. Existential angst, sometimes called dread, anxiety, or anguish, is a term that is common to many existentialist thinkers. It is generally held to be a negative feeling arising from the experience of human freedom and responsibility. The archetypal example is the experience one has when standing on a cliff, where one not only fears falling off it, but also dreads the possibility of throwing oneself off. In this experience that nothing is holding me back, one senses the lack of anything that predetermines one to either throw oneself off to stand still, and one experiences one's own freedom. It can also be seen in relation to the previous point how angst is before nothing, and this is what sets it apart from fear that has an object. While in the case of fear, one can take definitive measures to remove the object of fear, in the case of angst, no such constructive measures are possible. The use of the word nothing in this context relates both to the inherent insecurity about the consequences of one's actions, and to the fact that, in experiencing freedom as angst, one also realizes that one is fully responsible for these consequences. There is nothing in people that acts in the stead that they can blame if something goes wrong. Therefore, not every choice is perceived as having dreadful possible consequences. However, this doesn't change the fact that freedom remains a condition of every action. Despair in existentialism is generally defined as a loss of hope. More specifically, it is a loss of hope in reaction to a breakdown in one or more of the defining qualities of one's self or identity. If a person is invested in being a particular thing, such as a bus driver or an upstanding citizen, and then finds his being thing compromised, he would normally be found in state of despair, a hopeless state. For example, a singer who loses the ability to sing may despair if she has nothing else to fall back on, nothing to rely on for her identity. She finds herself unable to be what defined her being. What sets the existentialist notion of despair apart from the conventional definition is that existentialist despair is a state one is in even when he isn't overtly in despair. So long as a person's identity depends on qualities that can crumble, he is in perpetual despair, and as there is, in Sartrean terms, no human essence found in conventional reality on which to constitute the individual's sense of identity, despair is a universal human condition. As Kierkegaard defines it in either or, let each one learn what he can. Both of us can learn that a person's unhappiness never lies in his lack of control over external conditions, since this would only make him completely unhappy. Quote, "In works of love," he said, "when the God-forsaken worldliness of earthly life shuts itself in complacency, the confined air develops poison. The moment gets stuck and stands still, the prospect is lost. A need is felt for a refreshing, enlivening breeze to cleanse the air and dispel the poisonous vapors lest we suffocate in worldliness. Lovingly to hope all things is the opposite of despairingly to hope nothing at all. Love hopes all things, yet is never put to shame. To relate oneself expectantly to the possibility of the good is to hope. To relate oneself expectantly to the possibility of evil is to fear. By the decision to choose hope, one decides infinitely more than it seems, because it is an eternal decision. p. 246-250 Opposition to positivism and rationalism. Existentialists oppose definitions of human beings as primarily rational, and, therefore, oppose positivism and rationalism. Existentialism asserts that people actually make decisions based on subjective meaning rather than pure rationality. The rejection of reason as the source of meaning is a common theme of existentialist thought, as is the focus on the feelings of anxiety and dread that we feel in the face of our own radical freedom and our awareness of death. Kierkegaard advocated rationality as means to interact with the objective world, but when it comes to existential problems, reason is insufficient. Human reason has boundaries. Like Kierkegaard, Sartre saw problems with rationality, calling it a form of bad faith, an attempt by the self to impose structure on a world of phenomena, the other, that is fundamentally irrational and random. According to Sartre, rationality and other forms of bad faith hinder people from finding meaning in freedom. to try to suppress the feelings of anxiety and dread people can find themselves within everyday experience, Sartre asserts, thereby relinquishing the freedom and acquiescing to being possessed in one form or another by the look of the other. Religion. An existentialist reading of the Bible would demand that the reader recognize that he is an existing subject studying the words more as a recollection of events. This is in contrast to looking at a collection of truths that are outside and unrelated to the reader, but may develop a sense of reality. God. Such a reader is not obligated to follow the commandments as if an external agent is forcing them upon him, but as though they are inside him and guiding him from inside. This is the task Kierkegaard takes up when he asks who has the more difficult task, the teacher who lectures on earnest things a meteor's distance from everyday life, or the learner who should put it to use. Nihilism. Although nihilism and existentialism are distinct philosophies, they are often confused with one another. A primary cause of confusion is that Friedrich Nietzsche is an important philosopher in both fields, but also the existentialist insistence on the inherent meaninglessness of the world. Existentialist philosophers often stress the importance of angst as signifying the absolute lack of any objective ground for action, a move that is often reduced to a moral or an existential nihilism. A pervasive theme in the works of existentialist philosophy, however, is to persist through encounters with the absurd, as seen in Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, and it is only very rarely that existentialist philosophers dismiss morality or one's self-created meaning. Kierkegaard regained a sort of morality in the religious, and Sartre's final words in Being and Nothingness are all these questions, which refers to a pure and not an accessory reflection, can find the reply only on the ethical plane. We shall devote to them a future work. Etymology. The term existentialism was coined by the French Catholic philosopher Gabriel Marcel in the mid-1940s. At first, when Marcel applied the term to him at colloquium in 1945, Jean-Paul Sartre rejected it. Sartre subsequently changed his mind and, on October 29, 1945, publicly adopted the existentialist label in a lecture to the Club Maintenant in Paris. The lecture was published as L'existentialisme est un humanisme, a short book that did much to popularize existentialist thought. Marcel later came to reject the label himself in favor of the term neo-Socratic, in honor of Kierkegaard's essay on the concept of irony. Some scholars argue that the term should be used only to refer to the cultural movement in Europe in the 1940s and 1950s associated with the works of the philosophers Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Albert Camus. Other scholars extend the term to Kierkegaard, and yet others extend it as far back as Socrates. However, the term is often identified with the philosophical views of Jean-Paul Sartre.